So we're going to finish off Chapter 7 by looking at age structure diagrams. So an age structure diagram is a visual representation of age structure within a country for males and females. You have to be able to read them similarly to how you had to read chromatograms. So we need to be able to look at these and understand what's going on. It represents females and males, and it's usually broken up into pre-reproductive age, so under 15, those reproductive years between 15 and 44, and then post-reproductive populations that are 45 and older. It allows us to see the number of people that are of a certain age in a population, and allows us to analyze what that population is doing. So if you can see that the first one is a pyramid, and that's representative of an expanding population. It's typical of developing countries. They have large numbers of children and large numbers of people that can bear children, and they tend to have this expanding population. Type 2 is a stable population. It looks like a column. It's almost straight up and down. Little difference between the younger and the older age groups, and they'll have slow or no growth. And then the third one is a declining population or an inverted pyramid. The total fertility rate is below 2.1, and there's a decreasing number of females within each younger age. So that population would be declining. If we take a look at some actual data, which is how it'll be presented to you, if we look at India, we can see that India has an increase in population. So it's a population pyramid, and we would be able to look at that and say, yeah, that population is growing. And you can see that there tends to be more males in India than there are females. So you can sort of see little nuances that are different that might break down into specific questions as to why. The United States is fairly stable. If you look at that, it's sort of that column population that's going on there. And then Germany, which is our third one down below in the lower left corner, that's a declining population. So you can see people are choosing to have less and less children, and there's less people at the reproductive ages. And then finally, we have China, and you can see the population controls. You can see where those population controls began to take effect, and that those control measures will lead to population decline. Their population is going to be decreasing. We have what's referred to as population momentum. And population momentum is that it takes time for actions that attempt to reduce births to catch up with the growing population. Eventually, they will help stabilize. And so that's an example of China's, that prime example, is that we impose something to slow down population growth, but it takes a couple generations for that to catch on. It doesn't catch on right away. So as we start using contraceptives or those sort of measures, they don't click on instantly and all of a sudden people go from having 6 children to 2 children. It takes a couple generations for that to occur. So we have this momentum that even though we're implementing actions to attempt to reduce births, it's going to take a while to catch up. So we're going to look at some fertility and some total fertility rate influences. The major influences on total fertility rate are cultural traditions, social and economic status of women, education of women, family planning, and government policies. And so we will look at all of these things as we move through the rest of this unit here. So let's start with migration, which isn't a part of total fertility, but let's sort of get this idea of people moving out of the way. Net migration rate is the difference between immigration and emigration, so entering and leaving, in a given year per 1,000 people in a country. Positive means more people are entering than leaving. If we look at the United States has a total fertility rate of 2.1. And our age structure diagram that we just looked at is approaching a column shape. So we're approaching a static population. But we have a high rate of immigration. People want to come to the United States. And the U.S. population is going to increase by 44% by 2050. And the bulk of that will be due to immigration. So there's 1 million immigrants. So we have about 3.3 immigrants per 1,000 people. So that's significant. So you have to take that into account when you're thinking about population growth. Canada has 7 immigrants per 1,000, so there's a lot of people going to Canada, but their total fertility rate is much lower, 1.6. And then Georgia, which is in Western Asia, Their total fertility rate is 1.4, so they don't have that replacement fertility. They're not at 2. And they have a net migration, people leaving, of -5 per 1,000. So people are leaving the country of Georgia and Western Asia. And by 2050, it's expected that they will have a 24% decrease in population. That can be both beneficial and it can also be detrimental. You're losing workers. You're losing people to do jobs that you might need. You might be losing farmers or things like that. And it could be beneficial if you have more people than you can take care of. So there's pluses and minuses when we think about migration. Movement doesn't affect total population, but people are often displaced due to disease or natural disaster or environmental problems and conflict. So people that are choosing to leave a lot of times are leaving bad environmental conditions. This can create crowded and unsanitary conditions. It can create food and water shortages, refugee camps, and a lot of these efforts when we look at large groups of people that are moving is humanitarian and environmental health issues. If people move from developing to developed countries, they're going to have an increase in their ecological footprints. So where you lived, you might not have used as many resources, but if you're moving into a developed country, you'll have access to more resources to use and therefore have a bigger footprint. The demographic transition is the other really important graph for this unit. I don't like this version as much. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the definition is, and then we're going to move to a better version of this graph. So before 1600, global population growth was about 0.1%. It took about 700 years for the population to double. As we increased technology, healthcare, and sanitation, by 1965, it only took 42 years to double. Predicting that Earth's population will level off in 2100, we're not sure about that. But this theory of demographic transition is as a country moves from a subsistence economy to industrialization and increased affluence, it undergoes a predictable shift in population growth. So we can see this graph here, but really I prefer this graph for us to look at here. So let's take a look at this graph. I like this one because it's spread out a little bit better. The green line here represents the size of the population. So you can see the population grows and grows pretty rapidly and then levels off. If we look here, our birth and death rates are fairly close, but they're also fairly high. We're looking at somewhere between 30 to 40 births per 1,000 and deaths per 1,000. Our birth rate will sort of level off and then decline, but our death rate will also decline. So now it's important that we look at these 4 stages, stage 1, 2, 3, and 4. Human geo includes a 5. Environmental science likes to combine that into stage 4. So environmental science, we only have 4 stages of the demographic transition. So we need to be able to understand, define, and speak about all 4 of these stages. Phase 1 is pre-industrial. So it's a steady state. We have high birth and high death rates. We have a low life expectancy, high infant mortality due to disease and poor health care and poor sanitation. Children in this economy are an asset. And so in this phase, you need children because you have this subsistence economy. So you need farm workers. You need people to work on your farm. You need people to collect firewood. You need kids to go and get water. So it's beneficial for you to have a lot of children. There's also no social security. So when you grow older, your children are the ones that are going to take care of you. So this is what we think of in Western Europe or U.S. before the Industrial Revolution. But even some of our poorest nations have moved on to the next stage. So phase 2, now we're looking at Africa, Asia, China, India, some of our areas that have some really rapid population increases. So in phase 2, the death rates decline. You can see they decline rapidly. You can see that blue line going down. Due to modernization, there's better sanitation, there's cleaner water, there's better health care, there's vaccinations. But the crude birth rate doesn't decline because it takes a few generations. That's that population momentum for people to trust that they're going to live longer, to trust that these things are going to take effect. So and just sort of habit. Everyone in my family has had 6 to 10 kids, so that's what I'm going to have. But then it's going to become harder to support all those kids. So we will start to drop that birth rate off near the end, but that's that population momentum is going to take a while. Okay, this was the U.S. in the early 20th century. The U.S. now is in stage 3. So U.S., Canada, Australia is in stage 3. It's as economy and educational system improve, as family income increases, people have fewer children. These are developed countries. They have a more complex economy, and children, instead of becoming an asset so that they're working on the farm, they become a financial burden. Children are expensive, and so if you have a lot of them, it's costly. And we have more education, so we also have more birth control, which is really going to bring that birth rate down. You can really see it drop in stage 3. And then phase 4, this is Western Europe. So phase 4 is declining population size. You have a high level of affluence and economic development. So these are things like Japan, the United Kingdom, Germany, Russia, Italy. Fewer young and more old. There's different social and economic stresses. There's less people working and more people retired. So it puts an increase on taxes for Social Security. In Japan, there's actually assets or motivators for people to have kids because they need some people to enter the workforce and to help support the older population. You need to be able to understand all 4 of these stages and describe all 4 of these stages and what's going on in them, and maybe give representative countries. Not all countries follow this perfect demographic transition. Nicaragua does not follow it. It's the second poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, but it appears, based on what its population is doing, to be in phase 4. China is sort of ahead of Nicaragua, but behind the U.S. in terms of what transition it is, but it has lower population growth than U.S. due to its one-child policy. And here's just the text of what this demographic transition is. So if you needed to pause this video and make sure that you have some good, solid notes down, I would suggest that you do that. Fertility. So if we're looking at total fertility here, what goes into some family planning? It's the regulation of the number and the spacing of offspring through the use of birth control. We focus on maternal and child health. The difficulties are its gender inequality family planning in terms of, deals with females. And so family income increases. People have fewer children because you have more education and affluence, and therefore you have less children. You also have a higher age at first reproduction, so people wait longer. They're in school and college before they have their first child, and so you have a fewer number of children in your lifetime. Family planning, looking at Ethiopia, women that have gone to secondary school, their total fertility rate is 2.0 versus women that are uneducated, their total fertility rate is 6.1 per 1,000. Kenya in the 1980s is a good example. Kenya, the total fertility rate was 8 in the 1980s, but by the 1990s, the total fertility rate was 4. They cut that in half. They had a very active family planning campaign because they marketed that overpopulation would lead to unemployment and harm to the environment. In Thailand, in the 1970s, they encouraged birth control, and their growth rate went from 3.2 to 1.6. So if we look at some government policies in fertility, government involvement in terms of this, governments can determine the minimum age people may marry, the amount of compulsory education will slow down fertility rates. Budgets for family planning services, how much is your government willing to put into education, healthcare, old age security, incentives for smaller or larger family size? Looking at tax structure, are there additional charges or allowances based on family size? And 78 developing countries have recognized that they must limit their population growth in recent years. They need to take some actions. The most common one is China that we've spoken about. The 12 most populous countries in the world, China and India are at the top. And then we move down to some of our developed versus developing countries. If you notice, our developed countries, United States, Russia, Japan. And then we have developing countries. So it just gives you an idea, and it shows you that really large difference in China and India's population compared to the United States.